Most people think of flowers as passive structures. The interaction seems simple. Flowers provide nectar or pollen, insects visit, reproduction occurs. In this view, the flower functions almost like a signpost, visible, attractive, and waiting for something else to happen. But magnolias complicate that picture. Some magnolia species are capable of something that sounds almost impossible at first. They actively generate heat. This warmth is not simply trapped residual sunlight, and it is not the result of a sheltered blossom avoiding the wind. The flower itself can become warmer than the surrounding air. That fact changes the relationship between the ancient flower and the organisms that interact with it. A thermogenic magnolia blossom is not merely displaying itself to the world. It is actively changing the conditions inside and around itself. It creates warmth, alters scent dispersal, and changes the conditions experienced by visiting insects. In a small but meaningful way, it shapes its immediate world. Once we realize that, magnolias begin to look different. The flower is no longer simply a reproductive structure waiting to be discovered. It begins to resemble a temporary ecological space, a place where multiple organisms interact under conditions the flower itself has helped create. It is a warm blossom, a concentrated source of scent, a sheltered chamber among the branches, and a place where insects may feed, move, rest, and transfer pollen. Viewed this way, a thermogenic magnolia is not simply a flower. It is a temporary microhabitat, a warm, scented, protective meeting place built from living tissue. That is part of what makes magnolias so fascinating. The deeper we look, the less they seem like decorations and the more they resemble ancient biological technologies, refined over immense spans of evolutionary time to attract, shelter, and interact with life. To understand how extraordinary that is, we first need to understand what thermogenesis actually means. Thermogenesis means biological heat production. Humans generate heat biologically. Mammals and birds do as well. More surprisingly, some plants do it too. For many people, that last statement might feel contradictory. Plants are usually imagined as passive organisms. They grow toward sunlight, absorb water through their roots, and carry out photosynthesis. They are rarely thought of as generating heat in any meaningful way. Yet some plants do exactly that. When certain magnolia flowers open, parts of the blossom can become measurably warmer than the surrounding air. Researchers have recorded temperature increases of several degrees Celsius above ambient conditions, sometimes more depending on the species and environmental circumstances. The effect is not dramatic enough to feel like a heater in a room, but it is significant enough for insects. It is significant enough for scent dispersal. And it is significant enough that scientists have spent decades trying to understand why a flower would invest energy in producing warmth at all. The important thing to understand is that this warmth is not borrowed from the environment. A dark rock sitting in sunlight becomes warm because it absorbs solar energy. A greenhouse becomes warm because it traps heat. A thermogenic magnolia flower is doing something fundamentally different. It is generating heat internally. Inside the floral tissues, metabolism accelerates, sugars are consumed. Oxygen use increases. Cellular respiration speeds up. Instead of directing all available energy toward growth and maintenance, some of that energy is released as heat. The result is a flower that can become warmer than the air around it. Imagine a cool spring evening. The surrounding air begins to lose heat as daylight fades, leaves cool, branches cool. The landscape gradually adjusts to the lowering temperature. Yet inside a newly opened magnolia blossom, metabolism continues generating warmth. Not enough to transform the whole environment. Not enough to make the flower hot. Just enough to create a slightly different world inside the blossom than the one surrounding it. That difference may only be a few degrees, but for a small insect, a few degrees can matter. And that simple observation leads to a larger realization. The flower is not merely sitting in the environment, it is participating in it, it is doing something active, it is changing conditions. Once a flower begins changing conditions, entirely new evolutionary possibilities begin to emerge. At this point, a natural question appears. How does a flower actually generate heat? The answer begins with a process that occurs inside every living cell on Earth. Whether we are talking about a human, a bee, a bird, a mushroom, or a magnolia tree, cells require energy to stay alive. They need energy to grow, repair themselves, transport nutrients, build new tissues, and maintain the countless biochemical processes that keep living organisms functioning. To obtain that energy, cells perform cellular respiration. At its simplest, cellular respiration is the controlled breakdown of stored fuel. Sugars are consumed, oxygen is used, energy is released. Most of that energy is normally captured and stored in a molecule called ATP, often described as the energy currency of life. ATP allows cells to perform work. It powers growth, maintenance, movement, repair, and countless other biological activities. Under ordinary circumstances, cells are trying to be efficient. The goal is not simply to release energy. The goal is to capture as much of that energy as possible and put it to use. This is why thermogenic flowers surprised scientists for so long. They appear to do something that initially seems wasteful. Instead of capturing all available energy efficiently, they deliberately allow some of it to escape as heat. For a brief period during flowering, metabolism accelerates. Sugars are consumed more rapidly. Oxygen consumption increases. Respiration speeds up. Some of the energy that could have been directed toward cellular work is instead released into the flower's warmth. The blossom is not overheating. It is not damaging itself. It is simply shifting the balance toward a little less efficiency and a little more heat. One way to think about this is to imagine two engines running on the same fuel. The first engine is designed to capture every possible unit of energy and convert it into useful work. The second engine intentionally allows some of that energy to escape as warmth. Both are burning fuel. Both are functioning properly, but they are optimized for different outcomes. Thermogenic flowers briefly operate more like the second engine. The heat is not a malfunction. The heat is the purpose. At the cellular level, magnolias accomplish this using specialized pathways inside structures called mitochondria. Mitochondria are often described as the power plants of the cell because they generate much of the cell's usable energy. In mammals, certain forms of heat production involve specialized tissues, such as brown fat. Brown fat contains cellular machinery that allows fuel to be burned while producing relatively little usable energy and relatively large amounts of heat. Magnolias do not possess brown fat, of course. Plants evolved along an entirely different evolutionary path, yet they arrived at a surprisingly similar solution. Inside the mitochondria of thermogenic plants, alternative metabolic pathways can become active. One of the most important involves a mechanism known as alternative oxidase, often abbreviated as AOX. Without getting lost in technical detail, AOX provides an alternative route through the cell's energy production machinery. Instead of directing all available energy toward ATP production, part of that energy is diverted and released as heat. The flower becomes slightly less efficient and slightly warmer. What makes this especially fascinating is that the plant is paying a real biological cost to do this. Sugars that could have been stored are consumed. Energy that could have been used elsewhere is released. The flower is investing resources into heat production. That means natural selection must be receiving something valuable in return. Evolution rarely tolerates expensive behaviors unless those behaviors improve survival or reproduction. So the warmth is not accidental. It is not a side effect. It is not metabolic noise. It is a controlled biological investment. The flower is spending energy to change its environment. And once we understand that, another question follows immediately. Why would a flower deliberately spend precious energy making itself warm? What possible advantage could justify that cost? To answer that, we have to stop thinking about the flower only as a plant and begin thinking about it from the perspective of the insects that visit it. At first glance, the idea of a flower producing heat feels disconnected from anything familiar. Plants are plants, animals are animals. A magnolia blossom and a warm-blooded mammal appear to have very little in common. Yet when biologists began studying thermogenic plants more closely, they discovered something surprising. At a broad metabolic level, thermogenic flowers and thermogenic mammals are solving a remarkably similar problem. Both are taking stored chemical energy and converting part of it into heat. The details differ. The biological structures differ. The evolutionary histories differ. But the underlying principle is unexpectedly familiar. In both mammals and thermogenic plants, energy begins as stored fuel. Sugars are broken down, oxygen is consumed. Mitochondria become highly active. Energy is released, and some of that energy becomes warmth. If scientists measure oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production, fuel use, and heat output, the patterns can look surprisingly similar. This is one reason thermogenic plants attracted so much scientific attention when they were first studied in detail. They appeared to be doing something many people assumed belonged primarily to animals. They were using metabolism to generate heat. To understand why that is remarkable, it helps to think about how the human body normally operates. Most of the time, our cells are trying to be efficient. The fuel we consume is broken down and converted into ATP, the molecule that powers biological work. ATP allows muscles to contract, nerves to transmit signals, tissues to repair themselves, and cells to maintain their internal machinery. Heat is still produced because no biological system is perfectly efficient. But under ordinary circumstances, the goal is to capture as much useful energy as possible. Sometimes, however, mammals need warmth more than they need efficiency. When that happens, certain tissues deliberately shift the balance. One of the best-known examples is brown adipose tissue, often called brown fat. Brown fat contains specialized mitochondria equipped with a protein known as UCP1, or uncoupling protein 1. Without diving too deeply into the chemistry, UCP1 allows stored fuel to be burned while producing less ATP and more heat. The energy is not being captured for later use. It is being released immediately as warmth. In effect, the body sacrifices efficiency to gain temperature control. Magnolias do not possess brown fat. They do not possess UCP1. They did not inherit their thermogenic abilities from animals. Plants and mammals followed entirely separate evolutionary paths for hundreds of millions of years. Yet magnolias arrived at a broadly similar solution. Instead of using brown fat, thermogenic plants employ specialized metabolic pathways inside their own mitochondria. One of the most important involves alternative oxidase, or AOX. Like mammalian thermogenic systems, AOX allows part of the energy released during respiration to bypass the cell's normal energy-capturing machinery. The result is familiar. Fuel is consumed, oxygen use increases, ATP production becomes less efficient, more energy escapes as heat, the flower becomes warmer. This is a striking example of convergent evolution. Convergent evolution occurs when unrelated organisms independently arrive at similar solutions because those solutions solve important biological problems. Bird wings and bat wings evolved independently. The camera-like eyes of vertebrates and cephalopods evolved independently. And thermogenic mammals and thermogenic flowers appear to have independently discovered that warmth can be useful enough to justify burning extra fuel. That does not mean the systems are identical. The goals are very different. Mammals evolved thermogenesis primarily for survival. Warmth allows activity in cold environments, protects tissues from temperature extremes, and supports stable internal conditions. Magnolias evolved thermogenesis for ecological reasons. The flower is not trying to regulate its whole body temperature. It is not trying to survive winter. It is not attempting to maintain a constant internal environment. Instead, it is creating warmth that influences pollinators, affects scent dispersal, and alters the experience of visiting insects. One lineage is trying to stay alive, the other is trying to be found. We are reminded that evolution does not care whether an organism is a mammal, a bird, an insect, or a flower. If heat solves a biological problem, life will often find a way to produce it. And in the case of magnolias, that solution may have been operating while dinosaurs still walked beneath their ancestors. A modern human body generates heat. A modern mammal generates heat. A magnolia blossom generates heat. 3 very different evolutionary stories, one surprisingly similar biological strategy. Which brings us back to the question that still remains unanswered. If a flower is willing to spend precious energy generating warmth, what does it gain in return? At first, thermogenesis sounds expensive. The flower consumes additional fuel. It increases oxygen consumption. It deliberately becomes less efficient. From an evolutionary perspective, that raises an obvious question. Why would a flower spend precious energy generating heat? Natural selection is often ruthless about waste. If a biological trait consumes resources without providing a meaningful advantage, it tends to disappear over time. The fact that thermogenesis evolved repeatedly in different plant lineages suggests that heat must be providing something valuable in return. The answer appears to lie in reproduction. For a flower, reproduction depends on attracting the right visitors. Pollinators must find the flower, enter it, move through it, and carry pollen from one flower to another. Anything that improves those interactions can improve reproductive success. Heat turns out to be surprisingly useful for accomplishing exactly that. One of the clearest benefits involves scent. Many floral fragrances are made of volatile chemical compounds. These compounds evaporate into the air, creating the aromas pollinators detect from a distance. Temperature influences how easily those molecules move. Most people have experienced this phenomenon without thinking about it. A perfume becomes stronger when warmed. Fresh herbs release more fragrance when crushed or heated. The smell of a forest often intensifies after a warm rain. Heat helps scent travel. A warm magnolia flower can therefore broadcast its presence more effectively than a cool one. Its chemical signals spread farther through the environment. More insects notice it. More insects investigate. The flower becomes easier to find. But scent is only part of the story. The warmth itself is also attractive. For a small insect, even a slight increase in temperature can matter. A flower that is a few degrees warmer than the surrounding environment creates a different experience than one that matches ambient conditions exactly. The blossom becomes a warmer place to enter, feed, and remain. Because insects are small, those differences can have outsized effects. Warmer insects tend to be more active. They move more, crawl farther, spend more time exploring floral structures, and interact with more pollen-bearing surfaces. From the flower's perspective, all of that movement is valuable. Every additional contact creates another opportunity for pollen transfer. Every extra moment spent inside the blossom increases the likelihood that reproduction will succeed. Viewed from this perspective, the heat is not wasteful at all. The flower is spending energy to influence behavior. It is altering the environment in ways that encourage interaction. The warmth increases attraction, encourages activity, and helps create the conditions under which pollination becomes more likely. The energy is not being lost, it is being invested in attraction, interaction, and reproduction. Nowhere does that investment become more interesting than in the ancient pollination world where magnolias first evolved. When most people imagine pollination, they usually think of bees. A bee lands on a flower. It collects nectar. Pollen sticks to its body. The bee moves on. The image feels so familiar that it is easy to forget how recent that pollination world actually is. Magnolias emerged from a much older one. Magnolias belong to one of the oldest surviving flowering plant lineages on Earth. Their ancestors likely appeared roughly 95 to 100 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period. The world they entered looked very different from the one we know today. Flowering plants existed, but they were still expanding across the planet. Many modern pollination relationships had not yet evolved. Bee-specialized pollination systems were still in their early stages. Instead, many flowering plants relied heavily on a very different kind of visitor: beetles. To modern eyes, beetles may seem like unlikely pollinators. They do not hover gracefully. They do not move with the precision of bees. They are not particularly delicate. They crawl, push, chew, and force their way through floral structures. And unlike mammals and birds, beetles are ectothermic. Their activity depends heavily on environmental temperature. A warm environment allows greater activity. A cooler environment slows them down. Suddenly, thermogenesis becomes much easier to understand. The flower is not merely attracting beetles, it is creating a place where beetles want to stay. The blossom provides food, scent, shelter, warmth, and protection at the same time. From a beetle's perspective, it is not simply a flower. It is a destination, a tiny ecological refuge built from living tissue. The flower is no longer just a reproductive structure waiting for visitors to arrive. It is actively creating conditions that encourage those visitors to remain. The blossom is not simply advertising itself, it is hosting guests. And in doing so, it reveals something important about the ancient flowering world. Some of the earliest flowers may not have succeeded merely because they were visible. They succeeded because they became places where other organisms wanted to be. Many people have encountered photographs of bees resting inside flowers. A bumblebee tucked into a blossom at dusk, a solitary bee sheltered within petals during the night, or an insect apparently asleep inside a flower. Most of us interpret the scene in a simple way. The bee is resting, and the flower simply happens to be there. But flowers can provide more than a place to sit. Many bees, especially bumblebees, can generate heat themselves by vibrating their flight muscles without flying. This allows them to remain active under cooler conditions than many other insects. When a bee settles inside a flower, the petals reduce wind exposure, provide some concealment from predators, and help slow heat loss. In many cases, the bee supplies the warmth while the flower provides shelter. Thermogenic flowers introduce an intriguing variation. In some species, the flower itself contributes a small amount of warmth. Instead of a warm insect resting inside a passive structure, both the insect and the flower influence the local environment. This raises an obvious question. Could thermogenic flowers have influenced the evolution of flower sleeping behavior in bees? At present, we do not know. There is no evidence demonstrating that thermogenic flowers directly drove the evolution of flower sleeping behavior, and it is important not to overstate the idea. However, bees evolved in a world where thermogenic flowers already existed. Early flowering plants may have offered more than nectar and pollen alone. Some also provided shelter, structure, and perhaps warmth. Whether that warmth shaped bee behavior remains uncertain. What we can say is that flowers have long been more than simple feeding stations. For many insects, they function as temporary refuges within the surrounding environment. One of the most fascinating aspects of thermogenesis is not how it works, but how long it may have been working. The exact origin of floral heat production is difficult to determine because heat does not fossilize. No paleontologist can uncover an ancient flower and directly measure whether it generated warmth while alive. There are clues, however. Thermogenesis occurs in several ancient flowering plant lineages, including groups that diverged relatively early in flowering plant evolution. This has led some researchers to suspect that heat production may represent an old floral strategy rather than a recent innovation. If that interpretation is correct, thermogenic flowers may have existed for tens of millions of years, perhaps longer. Imagine a cool evening in a Cretaceous forest. Conifers rise overhead. Cycads and ferns crowd the understory. Somewhere beyond view, dinosaurs move through the landscape. Beneath the vegetation, a flower opens. Heat is produced. Fragrance spreads. Insects arrive. Nothing about the scene would look modern, yet the interaction itself would be familiar. An insect finds a flower. The flower influences the insect, and pollination occurs. The possibility that some version of this interaction may have existed deep in the age of dinosaurs is one of the reasons thermogenesis remains so compelling today. Magnolias are not the only plants that generate heat. One of the most famous examples is skunk cabbage. In early spring, some species can produce enough warmth to melt surrounding snow and maintain temperatures significantly above the outside environment. The Titan arum, or corpse flower, uses heat differently. During blooming, it warms itself while releasing an odor that resembles decaying flesh. The additional warmth helps spread scent molecules farther through the surrounding air, making the flower easier for pollinating insects to locate. The sacred lotus provides yet another variation. Rather than producing dramatic bursts of heat, lotus flowers can maintain surprisingly stable temperatures, even as surrounding conditions change. Other thermogenic plants employ similar strategies. Some use warmth primarily to intensify scent. Others appear to create favorable conditions for particular insect visitors. The details differ, but the pattern is consistent. Again and again, unrelated plant lineages have independently discovered that heat can improve pollination. At first glance, mammals, lotus flowers, corpse flowers, skunk cabbage, and magnolias appear to have little in common, yet all demonstrate the same basic principle. When warmth solves a biological problem, evolution often finds a way to produce it. The problems themselves differ. Mammals generate heat primarily for survival. Flowers generate heat for ecological reasons, influencing pollinators, scent dispersal, or reproductive success. The goals are different. The underlying strategy is familiar. Stored fuel is consumed, metabolism accelerates, and some of the released energy becomes heat. Biologists refer to this pattern as convergent evolution. Unrelated organisms independently arriving at similar solutions because those solutions solve important biological problems. Thermogenesis appears to be one more example of life repeatedly discovering a useful idea. Thermogenesis is fascinating on its own, but for magnolias, it may represent something more than an unusual physiological trait. Magnolias preserve traces of an older way of being a flower. Many modern flowering plants have evolved highly specialized relationships with specific pollinators. Magnolias emerged earlier, during a period when flowering ecosystems were often less specialized and more generalized. Their blossoms remain open, accessible, fragrant, and structurally robust. Rather than guiding a narrow range of visitors through highly specific interactions, they accommodate many different kinds of insects. Thermogenesis fits naturally within that picture. Warmth may have been one of several tools these flowers use to attract and retain visitors alongside scent, food, and shelter. Rather than simply advertising themselves visually, thermogenic flowers may have helped shape the conditions experienced by the organisms that entered them. Viewed this way, magnolias begin to feel less like a botanical curiosity and more like a surviving reminder of an ancient flowering world. When a modern magnolia blooms, it carries with it a lineage that has survived nearly 100 million years of planetary change. Continents shifted, climates transformed, entire ecosystems appeared and disappeared. Yet magnolias persisted. The insects that visit them today are not the same insects that visited their distant ancestors, but the underlying relationship remains recognizable. A flower attracts an animal. The animal responds. Pollination occurs. The details have changed. The interaction endures. That is what makes thermogenesis so interesting. Not simply that a flower can generate heat, but that the heat hints at ecological strategies that may have deep evolutionary roots. Magnolias remind us that flowers are not static objects. They are active participants in ecological relationships, shaped by millions of years of interaction with the organisms around them. And perhaps that is why thermogenic magnolias feel so unusual once we understand what they are doing. A flower opens, heat is generated, fragrance spreads, an insect arrives. For a brief moment, a relationship unfolds that may echo patterns far older than our own species. And then the flower closes, leaving behind a small reminder that some of the oldest stories in nature are still being told.